In this video, we'll prepare our project for the Chapter 5 app and start working with form views. And we'll just walk through most of this chapter in order to prepare ourselves for actually demonstrating a form view. So we'll discuss the types of forms, using form fields, cleaning forms, creating custom form fields, and then finally putting it all together. And so in our settings.py file, make sure you have activated the Chapter 5 app, and make sure that you have also created a Chapter 5 app within your project. Again, you can do that by right-clicking the Becoming a Django Ent Dev folder, navigating to Add, and selecting Django App, and then typing in all lowercase letters chapter_5. And when you do so, make sure you go to the apps.py file and update the path to your app for the name variable as seen here. And then moving on to the different types of forms, we'll be creating a file within our Chapter 5 app called forms.py. Go ahead and create this file or copy it from the code of this book into the same directory within your project. And here we're going to create a contact form, and we're going to use the form class that we imported from the Django.Forms library. And in this part of the book, we are also preparing ourselves for the model form, in which case we wrote a vehicle form class that uses the model form as well. And that comes from the Django.Forms library as well. For now, you could just add a pass statement until we actually write code in there. And so moving on to actually using some common fields and discussing some of the arguments that exist for them. Within our contact form, we will be creating a full name field to begin with. Here we use just a standard character field. These mimic a lot of the fields that come in a model class, except these are specifically for use within a form. And so whereas those objects within a model class usually have what's called a widget, and these also have a widget which render the actual input field. And then we also have validators. And validators are a way that we can compare what data is being inputted into the field. And as soon as it gets submitted and sent to the server, validator will compare that data and see if it's in proper format. And also some of these validators will apply attributes onto the HTML object that gets printed to the page. And some browsers, most browsers today, will actually use that to perform checks before the form actually gets submitted. And so here we have our full name field, and this is just to demonstrate things like our minimum and maximum length required, different error messages. Then we move on to 3 different types of email fields that I created for this chapter. And the first one is a character field that uses the email validator. The second one is an email field that uses the built-in email validator. And then the third one is a character field where we are performing our own validation when it gets sent to the server, so that we can use the clean methods to send a custom error message back to the front end. So these 3 different email fields will help demonstrate the differences in how validation works and where that validation is being applied, either on the client side or the server side. And conditional required is also another way that we're going to demonstrate how to clean an individual field, versus in this case we're cleaning the entire form itself, where we have access to the field values from other fields, not just the one particular field that we're performing validation upon. We'll get into that in a moment. And then here we've got our multiple emails, and this is when we get into creating custom form fields within this chapter. And so for our custom form fields, we will need to create a new file called fields.py within our chapter 5 app. And it's inside this file that we're going to create the multiple email field class, and we need to import the validation error from Django core exceptions library. We need the validate email method from the Django core validators library, the field method from the Django form fields library, and at least a text input from the Django Forms widgets. And here the custom field that we're creating is we want a long string of characters that are each email fields and separated by a comma. And so here we're inheriting the field class when we create our class, and with that we'll be able to define our widget, our default validators, and default error messages for any of the validators that we create. And so it does look pretty similar to what we had done in a previous chapter, chapter 4, where we created a custom path converter. Similar to that, we have a toPython method, and that's going to return the value that's split by the commas, and then we're going to validate that for each email that is found in that list of values. We're going to perform we're going to use the validate email method to validate whether or not it's a real email address or an email address format. And if it's not, then we're going to raise a custom validation error, and we're going to use the self error message email. So that's please enter a valid email address or addresses separated by a comma with no spaces. And then our code is email, and that's how how you create your own custom email, any field. And so moving back to our contact form within our chapter 5 forms.py file, to use that, we do need to import from our fields.py file the multiple email field that we just created and create the multiple emails field. And here we don't even need to define error messages because we had created that within our fields.py file here. But if we needed to override them with a custom, even more custom error message for only this form and not any other form class where this multiple email field may be used, then we could write it like this. And then to complete any kind of contact form, I added a message field here. So where we have our clean email clean email 3, that is where we're actually performing the validation on just this field. So we will only have access to that particular field's value. We won't actually have access to any other form value. So that is why there's a global clean method that we can use. And from here we could actually look into all of the cleaned data, which is self.cleaned data, and compare the email 3 field with the conditional required field, and use that to say if email exists and not text field, then we're going to add an error. And we're going to add that error on the conditional required field. And so that concludes explaining this. In the next video, we will actually demonstrate this. I'm going to break these two videos apart. In this video, we will be explaining what form views are and again, preparing more of our code to use the contact form that we just created before we actually move to that demonstration. And so in doing so, we will be working with form views, which Django offers 4 different main form view classes to choose from, that being a form view, a create view, an update view, and a delete view. And those all sound pretty self-explanatory. One of them is used to create, one of them is used to update, and another one's used to delete. And just a form view itself would be a form that's not linked to any kind of model, whereas the latter 3 would be linked to a model. And so in our Chapter 5 app, go ahead and make sure you have a views.py file. If not, go ahead and create one at this time. And inside of this file, we are going to be creating the form class view class. We're naming it that so that we know that we're working with this particular type of class for this demonstration. And we will be importing the contact form class that we created in the previous video in the forms.py file. And we will also need the form view class that comes from the Django Views generic edit library. And so here the form class view that we created is inheriting the form view class. And we're creating a template name, form class, and a success URL variables within this class. And the first one, we're defining the actual HTML template that we want to use. So this is a file that we will be creating momentarily. The form class links to the contact form that we created in the previous video. And the success URL tells us where to go once the form has been submitted and all validation has passed and everything is good, and so the system will take you to that URL, which we also have to configure our URLs. And so moving on to do that, make sure that in our main urls.py file that we have activated only the chapter 5 URL patterns. So make sure you've added this include statement into your main urls.py file. That way in our chapter 5 urls.py file we can begin writing our URL patterns. And so as always, I have created a homepage path for all of my apps. I would encourage you to do the same. For this exercise, we will need to import the template view class from the Django Views generic library, and we will be working with the repath method, and that comes from the Django URLs library. In the code of the book, I've provided non // and a version that accepts both / and non / for you to play around with and get a feel for how you could write URL patterns that can encompass all of those scenarios, depending on the needs and requirements of your own project. For working with this chapter, I have demonstrated the version that will accept both. And so we need a URL pattern that points to chapter 5 / form class with the dashes that you see here, and ending with these 3 characters. And then where that's going to point is the form class view that that we just created in our chapter 5 views.py file. And it is not necessary to overload the template. But it's being overloaded with the same value. And then for the success URL that we're defining here, we need to create that pattern within our chapter 5 urls.py file. This again is going to accept both / and non / at the end, and it's going to point to the same URL pattern, chapter 5 /contact form success that we defined in that form view. And here we're defining the actual template as chapter 5 contact success.html, which we will also create in a moment. And we're passing in just some basic keyword arguments at this time. So then moving back to our views.py file in our form class view class, we do need to create a get method and also a post method. And in the get method, we're going to return just a template response, and we could even provide some initial data as well. And I've provided some initial data within the code of this book, so that way when we do land to this page, we don't have to spend time filling it in. It's already going to have what it requires in order to successfully submit the form. So then if we wanted to trigger errors in order to demonstrate different concepts throughout this chapter, all we have to do is go into the form field and modify that value at that time. And then within our post method, this is what happens after the form has been submitted. And then it checks to see if the form is actually valid here. And then here we will either do an HTTP response redirect to the success URL if it's valid. If it's not valid, we want to return the same page with updated context that indicates that there was an error, and telling the user to please check below for the errors that exist and do what you can to correct them. Now moving on, we do need to create those HTML files. And so in our chapter 5 templates folder, also make a habit and practice of copying the base template 1 HTML file from every chapter of the book and copy that into your directory along with the corresponding headers and footer files, which would be necessary to work with that base template 1 file. It's the same exact format as the examples that we've done in chapter 4, and so we're just going to follow the same format throughout the rest of this book. And if you're copying it from a different chapter, make sure anywhere you see chapter 5 or _5 or -5, update it to the current chapter that you're on. And do the same with any related CSS and JavaScript files that exist within this chapter and any future chapter that you're working on. And now we'll need to create a new file in our chapter 5 templates folder. I'll close these here. We're going to call it formclass.html. That's form-class.html. And you can go ahead and copy all this from the code of this book, or you could handwrite everything that you see here. and that is in the rendering forms in templates section of this chapter. But basically, here we're going to demonstrate the four different ways that you can render a form. And so the basic default way would just be form right here. You could do form as P, form as table, or form as UL. And if you did it as a table, you would have to wrap it in a parent table, and as a UL, you'd have to wrap it in a parent UL, because these would only print out wrapped with LIs wrapped around them. And I believe that concludes preparing our environment for the actual demonstration. And again, I'm going to put that demonstration in a different video. In this video, we're going to demonstrate rendering forms in templates and using the form view class all in action. And so this completes the previous two videos in what we had prepared ourselves in writing the contact form. And so here my project is running, and I'm on the Chapter 5 homepage, and I'm going to navigate to the Chapter 5 form class URL. And we see here the full name field, email 1, 2, 3 field, the conditional required field, our multiple email field, that custom field that we created, and at last the message text area field. And within this page we see the header and the footer components that we've embedded into the what is it, the base template 1 file, and that came from an exercise or multiple exercises that we did earlier in Chapter 4 that we just copied over into Chapter 5 for using within this page. And so we also see that upon first page load, all of the fields within this form are pre-populated with information. That's dummy data that we told the form to actually populate with when we wrote this initial list in our get method of that form class view. And then we're passing that into when we render self.form class, and that's that contact form object that we created. And so what that means is that without typing anything into this form or modifying it in any way, when I hit the send message button, it should go to the success page that we created, and that's the Chapter 5 contact form success page. Again, it's also inheriting the same header and footer structure, and that came from the success URL that we defined within our form class view. And we highlight that, we'll see that in our post method we're doing our conditional check to see if the form is valid, which it was, and when that happens, just perform our response redirect to the destination that we specified. And so here I'm going to hit the back button. I'm going to do a hard refresh, Control Shift R. If you're on Windows, I think it's something Command R on a Mac. And here we'll then demonstrate the full name field, which we made a required field, meaning if I were to remove that and then hit the send message button, we see that it says please fill out this field. And if we look a little bit closer and inspect this element, we'll see on the input field itself there's a required attribute right here. And when that required attribute is present in most modern day browsers, such as Firefox, like you see here, or Chrome, or any of the other big ones, what that will do is it will prevent the form from actually submitting and going to the server. So this action is happening on the client side, on the browser, and no resources on your server are actually being used to perform this action. And that comes from within the contact form class that we wrote itself. On the field, full name field that we wrote, we have this required attribute, and that when used with a text input will automatically create that required attribute on the input field itself when it gets rendered to the page. Now if we put this back, we can move on to the email 1 field. Now that was created as a standard character field, but we're using the validators argument to pass in the email validator class that we imported from the Django core validators library. Now that library has a lot of other validators that you could use. For this particular example, this is what we chose to demonstrate. And so what that means is that it's not going to validate on the client side. It's going to send this information to the server, and then the server is going to validate and then either send a message back or send us to the success page, because every other field is now satisfied. So I'm going to hit the send message, and we see that it actually hit the server. And one way that I know is because of this errors found. And if I inspect this, we see that that is all part of the same h1 tag, and followed by a break, and it's wrapped in a small. Now if we go back to our chapter 5 views.py file and our post method, here we could see where we're actually writing this small and that break. And so we're passing that in as almost the same thing as within the get method, except we've added this extra stuff to indicate to ourselves that an error has occurred. And not only that, but it had reached the post method on the server in order to show us the error that occurred. And so on the individual field itself, it's telling us to enter a valid email address. So I could hit .com, and that will now be valid. Now moving on to email 2, the difference with that, if we go back to our forms and look at email 2, we see that instead of a character field, we chose to actually use an email field. And when doing that, we don't actually have to specify a validator's argument, which we did not here. So theoretically, if we trim this down to the exact same thing as we tried to do with the email 1, send the message, we'll see that email 1 is now valid after I've added that .com, and now it's telling us that email 2 needs to be a valid email address. So again, we know that it sent it to the server, hit the post method, and then sent the information back to the client. So now the user has a chance to correct the data, and we get to move on to email field 3. Now looking at this one, we chose to make this required false. That means we should be able to submit this And this must be where our clean method comes in. So theoretically, by looking at this with the required false and being a character field and no other constraints set on this field, we should expect this to actually submit and send us to the success page. And the reason why it's not is because within our methods, within the same class, we wrote a clean email 3 field. Now it's clean underscore and then the name of the field, so this could be any one of these. It could even be conditional required, but it has to match that name. So make sure you do match that name. So here we're getting itself from the cleaned data, and if you were to actually dig into that clean data, you'll see that only that is available to us at this time. Here we're checking to see and make sure that it doesn't equal nothing, and if it does equal nothing, we're going to add an error that says that this field is required, which is what we got there. Now if it doesn't equal nothing, we're going to try to validate that email, again using the validate email method that we imported from the Django Core Validators library. And if it's not a valid email, we're going to add an error, and the error message will then say the following is not a valid email address, and print the value that the user entered into here. So if I were to do something like this, we should expect to see this as part of the error message itself. Which we now do. And then looking at this, the required only if label 3 has a value. That was a value that I also removed before I submitted the form. So moving on to this, I can correct this value now, and it's within a format that should be email format. We could look into the conditional required field next. The conditional required field is a character field, and here we're actually practicing with the text input widget, which we also did on the full name field. We're telling it required is false, but then instead of doing a clean conditional required, we're doing a clean. And that's because we want to compare email 3 with the conditional required field. We want to see if the email and text field both exist, or if one or the other exists. If email exists and not the conditional required field, then we're going to add an error and say if there's a value in the field labeled email 3, then this field is required. And that is what we see here. And you could use these print statements to dive into the cleaned data and be able to see what is there and why you would have to use a clean versus a clean particular field. So now if I send this message, it should be a success. I'll go back. I'm going to hit a hard refresh on this one. Actually, I'm just going to reload the page. Now, the multiple email field, this one is performing the validation within the custom class that we created itself. So if I were to just modify one of these, please enter a valid email address or addresses separated by a comma with no spaces. .com space. Interesting. And I bet you the space gets handled when we split. No, actually the space gets replaced. But our message still says, please enter valid email address separated by a comma with no spaces. So we're still telling the user no spaces, but we're removing the space in our toPython method. And then our messages, which is a text area, also has a required attribute added to it. And so you can see that even with text areas, which is a different type of widget, it will still apply that. And so that concludes the first demo, where we are working with the contact form and working with a form view class. In this video, we will be linking models to forms with the create view class. And so in our chapter 5 forms.py file, let's go ahead and make sure we have the model form class imported from the Django.forms library. And we will also need our vehicle model class that we created in our chapter 3 models.py file. And we will be creating a class called vehicle form that inherits the model form class that we just brought in. And here all we really have to do is define a meta subclass, and the options that we're going to focus on are just the model, linking that to the vehicle class that we just brought in, and the fields that we actually want to include within that form. That being the VIN, the sold, the price, the make, the vehicle model, and the engine fields. And one way that one reason you could, or what would want to type these out individually versus using underscore underscore all underscore underscore, similar to this, would be because you can define the order this way. Say there, you want the order to appear in an order that it wasn't written within the model itself, because if you use the all, it would print that out in the order that it was written in the model. And here you can omit certain fields as well. And moving on to the chapter 5 views.py file, we'll be creating a class called model form class create view. And the idea behind that is that we're using the create view class that we're importing from the Django views generic edit library. And we're going to combine that with an HTTP response redirect, so that we can point ourselves to the success page once we have submitted a valid form. And we'll also need the template response class that we imported from the Django template response library. And we will also need a vehicle form class that we started in a previous video, but at this point you probably have just a pass statement written in that form. We'll go ahead and add more code momentarily. And so in our model form class create view, it will inherit the create view class that we just imported. This also has 3 different variables, pretty similar to the other form class that we've form view that we wrote, where the template name is the HTML file that we wish to render. The form class is the form that is linked to this view, and then a success URL telling us where to go once we have completed the form successfully. And we will be using a get method. Here we're going to just return the template response and some pre-populated data, and the form is the form class that we've defined above. And by our form set is an inline form set that we haven't done at this time. And then the post method, it works just like the other form view that we wrote, where once the form is submitted, the post method is run. Here we're going to perform validation on the form and see, is the form valid? If it is, we want to save the vehicle to the database, and then do our redirect to the success URL. And if it is not valid, we want to return itself, basically refreshing this page, populating the form with whatever the user had entered into the form, and indicating to the user that errors were found. So here we'll see at the top on the H1 tag the same red errors found message. Now moving on to our chapter 5 URLs.py file, we will need to create a model form, chapter 5 model form class URL pattern. And this we're going to use the repath that is formatted to accept both / and non /. We're going to import the model form class create view that we just created from our chapter 5 views.py file and render that as view. And you don't have to overload this, but this is the same value that we defined within that class. So if you did want to overload it, that would be how you do it. And we will also need our vehicle form success URL, and that's chapter 5 vehicle form success. This will render a template view pointing to vehicle success.html and has some keyword arguments that we're going to pass into that template. Now we need to create the model form class.html file in your chapter 5 templates chapter 5 folder. And you can copy this from the code of the book, or you can write what you see here. And this is structured in the exact same way as the form class.html file that we wrote as well. So keep that in mind. I separated them by file for educational purposes. Now what we could do is make sure you also copy from the code of the book the vehicle success.html file, which you see here. And moving on to our browser, let's go to the Chapter 5 model form class URL. And here we'll see a blank form. It's not formatted in any kind of fancy way. I didn't break these down onto different lines or anything. I kept the CSS file pretty minimalistic. But this does group them naturally. This is how the HTML is rendered. So a label gets printed first, then the input field. And voila. So it didn't like that I entered a comma on the price field. This would be extra work that you would have to write into your project in order to accommodate that. And really what you might want to do is on the front end apply a JavaScript input mask is what they're called. There's a lot of different JavaScript libraries you could choose that will automatically format your price in comma format and strip out any characters. Say the user enters in a bunch of letters like that. That would be how you could get around that. Could be handled on the Django side on the back end, but you would have to submit the form in order for that to happen. So the best way would be is if you apply that check on both sides, the client side and the server side. And that concludes the Create View demonstration. In this video, we're going to work with the Update view for working with our vehicle model. And so in our Chapter 5 URLs.py file, we will need to add a new URL pattern for model form class that we're just going to add another / and the path converter that we're looking for is an ID, and so it's going to be a numeric value that we're looking for. And here we're going to use the model form class update view that we're about to create. So go ahead and import that from the chapter 5 views.py file so that we may use it here. And here you can give it a name attribute of vehicle detail. Now in our chapter 5 views.py file, let's go ahead and create that model form class update view. Here we're inheriting the update view class, which we need to make sure is imported from the Django views generic.edit library. And just like a lot of the other classes that we've worked with, we're going to define a template name, a form class, and a success URL. The success URL will be the same success URL that we used before on the model form class create view. That way we don't have to go and create another URL pattern for that. It should already be loaded in your chapter 5 urls.py file. And here we're going to use the same vehicle form that we also created in the previous video, where all we're doing is inheriting the model form class and passing in our vehicle as the model and defining the fields that we wish for that. And just like the other classes, we do need to write a get method. And here we're going to try to look up the vehicle by ID. And that ID is being passed to us in the get method. And that comes from a keyword argument defined in the URL pattern itself, right here. And so if the vehicle is found, we're going to create a new form class instance with the vehicle passed into it. If not, we're just going to create a blank form. And then we'll return a template response with some pre-formatted keyword arguments and as well the form object that we've just created. And then we do need a post method, and this post method is going to use the same code that we used in the previous example. Now, making sure that our project is running, we can go to our browser, and now we can try to access, say, object number 2, which would be vehicle number 2. And prior to this, you do need to make sure that you've loaded the chapter 3 fixture. That's the chapter3.json file. If you haven't, please go ahead and make sure you do that at this time, because this data is going to be reliant on you actually being able to load this page or not. So here we have a form that has been pre-populated with the values found for each field within model vehicle model primary key 2. And that concludes being able to link a model to an update view. I am going to tell you, if you try to update any of these in its current state, you will get some errors because of the VIN number being a unique field. So if we go back to chapter 3 models.py, vehicle, we'll see that the VIN number has a unique attribute of true. And because that is so we're going to have to do extra work that is beyond the scope of this book in order to use the update view and save data. Otherwise, you may run into the VIN number already exists. And that concludes this video. In this video, we'll be adding inline form sets to the form view class that we originally wrote earlier in this chapter. And so we'll be using the same chapter 5 model form class URL that you see here, where we're creating a vehicle. Now, in our chapter 5 forms.py file, we will need to create a prospective buyer form. And this is going to inherit a form class that comes from the Django.Forms library. And we'll give it a first name and a last name field just to capture an example of an individual who might be an additional buyer. Now, yours might want to include an email or a phone number or some way to contact that person back. And next we'll need to create a prospective buyer form set. And so that's this guy right here. Now what that actually is a form set factory that we're importing from the Django.Forms library. And extra means that there will be one additional blank field printed on the page when we come to the page. Now in our chapter 5 views.py file, we're going to work in the model form class create view that we did in a previous video. So this class should already be created in your file. If it's not, please go back earlier in this chapter and work on building out these components. In our get method, we will be adding this buyer form set, and that's what will equal the prospective buyer form set that we created in our forms.py file. And then in our template response, we'll need to add that context into what we're sending to the template. And also in our post method, we'll have to do the same thing and add the prospective buyer form set. This time we're going to pass in the request.post, whereas earlier we just passed nothing in there and used the default state. Then in our template response, should the form no longer be valid, we still have to pass in the buyer form set object in that context as well. Now let's go ahead and edit the model form class.html file that exists for this view method, view class. So that's the Chapter 5 model form class that you see here. And it's in here where we want to say, okay, if buyer form set exists, this way it's not going to error out if it doesn't exist or it equals nothing. And then we're going to create a new header called prospective buyers. And here we need to always make sure when we're working with inline form sets that we include this management form that you see here. And then non-form errors is if we do want to see errors that pertain to that. And then in this loop that we see here, where we're using a for and for statement, we're looping through for each form in the buyer form set. We want to create this chunk of HTML that's formatted in this way with a first name, last name, and a delete button if the user is able to delete it. Now, if it's a brand new blank form, like the extra that we told it to print after, then there won't be a delete button at that time. And then we also need to create the add form set button, and the ID we're going to link to an actual action that we're going to write in JavaScript. Now, if we refresh this page, we should be able to see the prospective buyers at this time. And that's the first name and last name field. Add another prospective buyer, and then the original save button that we saw before. Now, we do need to finish this up with some JavaScript in order to make it work, because right now this button shouldn't do anything, at least on your system. It might on mine. So going back to our model form class, we see at the top that it extends the base template1.html file. And this is a standard format that we're going to adopt for every chapter in this book on how we build our templates. And looking in here, we have a script that points to the site-js.js file and pointing specifically to the chapter 5 JS file. And so it's in there that we're going to write the JavaScript that you see here. If you wanted to do this manually, you can use the mkdir command and create the folders that you see here, and then use the touch command to well, you first use the cd command to change into this directory, and then use the touch command to create the file that you see here. Once it's created, add all of the code that you see here, which will add an event listener that listens for the click action on our add form set button. And that is by this ID that you see here. And so when that occurs, it will fire off this action, this function, and here we're going to update the management data and update attributes that exist within some of those management forms as well. And we're always going to clone the first form set container, which should be an empty form. So now when we come to this page and refresh, we should be able to add another prospective buyer. Now follow that same pattern to remove the object and then subtract a number from all of the objects within the management form. And if we inspect the element here, we can see that we have some hidden input fields, and each of these input fields are part of our management form. And this initial form and total forms value is going to tell Django how many of these exist and how many to process. And that concludes this video.